He mocked an entire country's culture live on air. Until Keanu Reeves looked up and said just one quiet sentence that changed everything. What began as a celebrity cooking segment became a global reckoning on respect, memory, and truth. But what did Keanu reveal that left the arrogant chef completely speechless? Watch to find out. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning haze hung low over the Los Angeles skyline as Keanu Reeves stepped out of the black SUV that had quietly pulled up to the side entrance of a sprawling production studio. There were no fans waiting, no photographers crowding the gates. This wasn't a movie premiere or press tour. This was something different, more subdued, more personal. A production assistant greeted him with a clipboard and a nervous smile, then led him through a quiet corridor that smelled faintly of hairspray and stage lights. The sound stage ahead was buzzing with preparations, crew members wheeling lighting rigs, makeup artists fussing with brushes, and production managers whispering into headsets. But through it all, Keanu walked in silence, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes calm but focused. He had done this countless times. Studios, interviews, spotlights. But today's show carried a tension he couldn't quite name. Global Kitchen Masters, a syndicated international cooking competition with a talk show twist. Known for its glossy production and unpredictable guest pairings, the show had been chasing ratings with increasingly outrageous stunts, celebrity guest judges, fusion cook-offs, even culinary pranks. When Keanu had first received the invitation, he hesitated. It wasn't his style. He didn't like media spectacles, didn't chase exposure, but the producers had pitched something different this time. They wanted him as a cultural ambassador, not for a film, not for Hollywood, but for international cuisine, and specifically, they said, for Spain. That word had made him pause. Spain. He remembered the tiled kitchen in Seville, the scent of garlic and tomatoes simmering slowly on an old stovetop, the hum of a ceiling fan, the quiet, rhythmic voice of Carmen as she showed him how to tear bread into soup with reverence, not haste. The assistant brought him into a small dressing room. It was stark, just a mirror, a black armchair, and a garment rack with a few outfit options provided by wardrobe. But Keanu had come prepared. He waved off the stylist politely and kept on his own clothes, a plain black t-shirt, dark jeans, his signature scuffed boots, clothes that didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. He sat down slowly, hands still in his lap. His thumb brushed against the folded slip of paper in his jacket pocket. He took it out, carefully. It was old, creased from too many folds, the ink slightly faded. A handwritten recipe, gazpacho, written in uneven cursive, entirely in Spanish. At the top, a name, Carmen Vasquez. Keanu held it gently between his fingers for a moment, just breathing. He hadn't come on this show to promote himself. He had come because when he read the script and saw who else would be on set that day, something inside him said he needed to be there. Not to argue, not to prove a point, but maybe to protect something. Something he still carried with him every day. Through a crack in the dressing room door, Keanu could already hear the distinctive voice of Marcus Thornfield echoing down the hallway. Smooth, British, overconfident. It had that polished tone that television loved, sharp enough to be interesting, arrogant enough to be controversial. Marcus had arrived early, the producers told Keanu. He'd brought his own entourage, his own knives, and even his own lighting preferences. That didn't surprise anyone. Marcus had made a career out of being difficult. A master chef turned media provocateur, he built his brand on tearing down others, especially traditional cuisines he deemed provincial. Spanish food had been his latest target. Keanu had seen the clips. One interview in particular stood out. Marcus had scoffed at jamón ibérico, called gazpacho chilled vegetable water, and laughed at the idea that rustic Spanish cooking deserved the same respect as serious cuisines like French or Japanese. His words weren't just dismissive, they were surgical, designed to humiliate, designed to dominate. The producers thought this pairing would make for good television. Controversial chef meets beloved actor. Sparks fly. Everyone wins. But they didn't know what Spain meant to Keanu. They didn't know he'd lived there quietly for nearly 2 years, far from the public eye, after the death of someone he loved. They didn't know he had spent weeks in the homes of everyday Spaniards, cooking, listening, grieving. They didn't know about Carmen, or the Mendoza family, or the letter from a young chef in San Sebastian that he still carried in his suitcase. They only knew he had once praised a paella restaurant in an old interview. Now Marcus's voice grew louder. He was rehearsing his opening remarks, tossing out insults like confetti. "Nothing but glorified bar food," he said. "Sentimental nonsense passed off as cuisine." Keanu looked down at the recipe again. He didn't want conflict. That wasn't his way. But something about Marcus's words triggered more than irritation. They stirred something sacred, not because he wanted to win an argument, but because he'd seen what Marcus was mocking. He'd sat at those tables. He'd wept over those meals. There was a knock on the dressing room door. "Mr. Reeves, we're ready to mic you up. You're on in 10. Keanu folded the recipe carefully, placed it back in his jacket, and stood. His movements were deliberate, calm. But behind the stillness, something had begun to settle in him. Not anger, not pride, but purpose. As he walked toward the set, passing cameras and makeup stations, the energy in the studio began to shift. Not because anyone saw what he carried, but because something in his presence felt heavier than usual. Focused, rooted. Marcus was on the main stage already, flashing his trademark smirk. Keanu stepped into the shadows just off camera, waiting for his cue. And in his pocket, the recipe rested quietly. A folded memory, a quiet truth. One he was almost certain would be needed before this was over. The stage manager gave the final countdown. 3, 2, 1. The bright lights of Global Kitchen Masters flared to life, bathing the studio in gold and steel moule. The opening jingle played through hidden speakers as the audience clapped on cue, guided by a red flashing sign above the set. On center stage, host Miranda Wells smiled into the camera with practiced warmth. She greeted the audience, introducing the night's theme, International Fusion, and teasing the culinary fireworks about to unfold. But behind her eyes was a flicker of unease. She, like everyone else, had seen the tension in the guest pairing notes. She knew Marcus could be cruel. And she knew Keanu didn't perform drama for sport. If there was going to be a moment tonight, it wouldn't be scripted. Keanu waited quietly in the wings as the audience applause peaked again. "Please welcome our cultural ambassador for the evening," Miranda said, her voice rising with excitement, "the one and only Keanu Reeves." Keanu stepped onto the stage, walking slowly but with purpose. The crowd applauded warmly. No cheering, no theatrics, just respect. He offered a small nod, not a wave. Took his seat across from Marcus, who barely concealed a smirk as he leaned back in his chef's coat. Marcus greeted him with a clipped, theatrical British accent. "Pleasure to meet you, Keanu. I hear you've dabbled in culinary appreciation." Keanu returned a calm, unreadable smile. "I've had the privilege of learning from some remarkable kitchens," he said. Marcus raised an eyebrow, amused. Miranda jumped in quickly, pivoting to the show's premise. "We'll be discussing how traditional dishes influence modern culinary trends," she said, "and exploring whether nostalgia belongs in the future of food." Marcus laughed under his breath. "If we must," he muttered, loud enough for the microphones to catch. Miranda continued her introduction, walking the audience through what to expect. A few sample tastings, cultural conversations, and a closing discussion on the most influential global cuisines of the 21st century. It was meant to be light, palatable, polished, but under the surface, something deeper was already stirring. As Miranda spoke, Keanu's fingers brushed the edge of the recipe still in his pocket. He wasn't planning to bring it out. Not yet. Not unless the moment called for it. Across from him, Marcus was adjusting his sleeves, glancing at the camera angles on the nearby monitor. Confident, unchallenged, ready for another night of provocations and applause. But what Marcus didn't know, what no one in the studio yet understood, was that this night wouldn't follow the script. The balance of power on global kitchen masters was about to shift. Not with a shout, not with a spectacle, but with a story. And Keanu had carried that story across oceans, through grief, and now into this studio. Not for revenge, but for truth. And as the segment countdown began and the lights faded into their first commercial break, a quiet stillness settled over Keanu. The kind that only comes before something sacred is spoken. Long before the cameras started rolling, Marcus Thornfield had already taken control of the studio. He arrived an hour earlier than scheduled, dressed in a perfectly pressed white chef's jacket with his initials embroidered in gold thread. His entourage moved like a private security team. Stylists, a personal sous chef, and a handler whose job seemed to be telling other people to move faster. The sound technicians kept their heads down. The lighting crew adjusted the gels 3 separate times to meet his demands. Nobody pushed back. Marcus was the kind of guest who made everyone nervous and made sure they knew it. Inside the test kitchen segment area, he stood at the center, like a general surveying a battlefield. "This countertop is all wrong," he said to a stagehand. "And whose idea was it to place the garlic near the basil? Have you people ever even plated for television?" The crew exchanged glances but didn't respond. Marcus picked up a chef's knife from the display rack and examined it, turning it slightly under the studio lights. "Dull," he muttered. "Get me my own set." When someone brought over Keanu's seating card and set it on the far side of the demonstration table, Marcus watched with disinterest, then smirked. "So, we're doing the celebrity tourist with a conscience thing again," he said loudly, shaking his head. "He's here to make us feel bad for liking foie gras, isn't he?" A few staffers chuckled uncomfortably. The assistant director pretended not to hear. Marcus continued, now speaking to no one in particular. "Don't get me wrong, I like Keanu. The man's got sad eyes and soulful stares for days. Very cinematic. But why is he judging cuisine? Let him judge a film festival. Or maybe a beard competition." He placed the knife back on the table, carefully aligned. "Besides," he added, loud enough to carry, "I've seen his interviews. Man once called jamón ibérico life-changing. That tells me everything I need to know." The tone wasn't just dismissive, it was surgical. He didn't just disagree, he belittled. He framed reverence as ignorance, and behind the humor, there was a sharp edge that dared anyone to challenge him. From a nearby corner, Miranda Wells was watching. She had hosted Global Kitchen Masters for over a decade. She'd sat next to world-class chefs, street food geniuses, and cultural icons. She had seen ego, charm, brilliance, and collapse. But Marcus was different. He was television gold. Every time he trended, ratings surged. Audiences didn't just watch him, they waited for him to say something outrageous. That was his magic. He poked the bear, insulted the village, and walked away richer for it. But tonight, as she watched him grin to himself while criticizing a cuisine he clearly didn't understand, something about the pairing didn't sit right. Keanu Reeves wasn't here for showmanship. And if Marcus didn't realize that soon, this wouldn't be just another taping. It would become something else entirely. Marcus Thornfield moved through the prep kitchen like it was his kingdom. Every towel had to be folded a certain way, every ingredient placed just so, not for ease of use, but for how it would appear on camera. A second camera crew was brought in just to capture his hand movements while chopping. "No close-ups on garlic if it hasn't been properly blanched," he told the director. "I'm not having my segment ruined by amateur mise en place." He spoke as if he were doing everyone a favor by being there. The producers were used to it. They expected this behavior. In fact, they counted on it. Marcus was a villain audiences loved to hate. His takedowns were legendary, and every time he tore into another culinary tradition, the social media buzz guaranteed a spike in traffic. The more offensive he got, the more valuable he became. Still, even the seasoned crew could feel something different about today. He had already made 3 separate remarks about peasant dishes dressed up for Western palates. One of the producers, trying to lighten the mood, joked that maybe Keanu would surprise him. Marcus didn't laugh. "Keanu? Oh, come on," he replied. "He's got that brooding artist energy, sure. But don't mistake that for depth. He's a brand. A beautiful, tortured brand. You know what that means? He's not going to challenge me. He's going to sit there and nod and maybe say something cryptic about empathy." He paused, then added, "He's been to Spain, right? Probably wandered through some olive groves with a poet, had a rustic stew under a tree and called it life-changing." There was no malice in his tone, just a breezy superiority that suggested he thought he was above it all. Above tradition, above emotion, above being challenged. Miranda stood by the monitors with her arms crossed, pretending to review cue cards. In reality, she was listening, not just to Marcus's words, but to the energy in the room. Something felt volatile, not explosive, but electric. She had interviewed Keanu twice before. Quiet, respectful, thoughtful. He spoke slowly, like every word had been measured before release. He didn't posture, he didn't deflect, but when he chose to speak with weight, people listened. And Marcus? Marcus only knew how to fill silence. She looked down at her notes. Spanish cuisine, family recipes, cultural heritage. Tonight was supposed to be about the emotion behind tradition, about connection through food, not about demolition disguised as expertise. Marcus called out from across the room, "Miranda, darling, let's not waste time with sentiment. Let's give the audience what they want. Fire, conflict, drama." Miranda offered a tight smile and walked to her chair. The crew signaled that taping would resume in 5 minutes. And as Marcus adjusted his collar and prepared to deliver another culinary takedown, Miranda glanced toward the backstage area where Keanu waited. She had a feeling this episode wouldn't end the way Marcus expected. Marcus took his seat with theatrical ease, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket like he was about to walk a Paris runway rather than co-host a segment on cultural cuisine. The studio lights cast a soft glow on his face, just the way he liked it. He glanced over at the seating arrangement again and made a face. He'd like, "Should have put me center." "Why are we giving the middle chair to the actor?" he whispered to one of the assistants, just loud enough for the nearby crew to hear. Then he leaned back and looked toward Miranda. "I hope you're ready," he said with a smirk. "I've got a few thoughts about fusion food that might raise some eyebrows." Miranda's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm sure you do." The countdown to live taping began again. In the final seconds, Marcus straightened in his seat and turned on his signature camera face. Part philosopher, part provocateur, all showman. He was a man who believed in the power of performance, not presence. Behind the scenes, Keanu watched from a dim corner of the set. The producers had given him final mic checks, reminded him of where to sit, and coached him on how to respond if Marcus got out of hand. He had nodded politely to all of it, but said very little. Now, as the lights settled and the intro music faded out, the studio audience gave a polite round of applause. Miranda welcomed viewers back, her voice bright and smooth. She introduced Marcus with energy and ease, listing his accolades and awards. He smiled like he was being crowned king of cuisine. Then she introduced Keanu, her tone shifting slightly, becoming softer, more reverent. The applause swelled again. Keanu stepped onto the stage, offering a quiet nod to the audience and a handshake to Miranda. He took his seat without fanfare. Just presence. Just stillness. Marcus glanced at him sideways and leaned in just a little too close. "So, Keanu," he said, "you ready to defend tapas and tomato bread in front of a global audience?" Keanu's lips curled slightly. Not quite a smile, just a response. "I'm here to share what I've learned," he said simply. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "From food bloggers or grandmothers?" Miranda quickly moved things forward before the tension had time to settle in. "Let's begin," she said, "by talking about how traditional cuisines shape identity. Marcus, you've been very vocal about the limits of some cultural food traditions, especially Spanish. Care to elaborate?" Marcus sat back like he'd been waiting for that invitation all day. "Gladly," he said. "Spanish food is, well, charming. It's rustic. But let's not pretend it belongs on the same level as truly sophisticated cuisines. I mean, come on, bread with tomato? Sardines in a tin? People get emotional about this stuff, but sentiment doesn't equal substance." The audience chuckled nervously. Miranda glanced at Keanu, unsure if he would respond. But he didn't. He just watched. The stillness before the storm. The segment began with a clean camera sweep across the studio. The music faded out, the lights settled into their full brightness. The logo of Global Kitchen Masters gleamed behind the set in a soft orange glow. On the table between the guests sat an elegant arrangement of tasting dishes, each one tied to the night's theme of international fusion. Miranda introduced the first round with practiced charm. "Let's start with a Mediterranean comparison. Our chefs have prepared interpretations of traditional dish, some Spanish, some French, some Greek. We'll taste, we'll compare, and we'll talk about how food tells a story." She turned to Marcus. "Would you like to begin?" "With pleasure," Marcus said. He reached for the Spanish plate first, a small, refined version of paella served in a minimalist ceramic bowl. It was dotted with delicate curls of saffron rice, mussels, and thinly sliced chorizo. Marcus inspected it with mock seriousness. "This," he said, holding up a spoonful, "is what I like to call rustic confidence. It's the kind of dish that wants you to think its charm lies in its humility." He took a bite, chewed, tilted his head, and sure, it's fine. But let's not kid ourselves. It's a dish built on leftovers. Whatever you didn't finish yesterday gets thrown in with some rice and a dash of paprika. Suddenly it's heritage. The audience chuckled lightly, unsure if they should. Miranda offered a cautious smile. "And yet, it's one of Spain's most iconic dishes," she said. Marcus nodded, still chewing. "Iconic doesn't mean impressive. Paella is comfortable. Safe, the culinary equivalent of a family photo album. Nice to look at, but not something you'd serve in a serious restaurant." The camera cut briefly to Keanu. He was still, completely still. His hands resting lightly on his knees, posture upright but relaxed, his eyes focused on Marcus, not angry, not amused, just observing. Miranda turned to him. "Keanu, you've spent time in Spain? What's your take on paella?" Keanu paused before speaking. "I think it depends on what you're hungry for," he said quietly. Marcus jumped in before Miranda could redirect. "Exactly. If you're hungry for comfort food, nostalgia, maybe a little homespun romance, sure. But if you're hungry for complexity, technique, actual innovation, Spain isn't where you go." He gestured to the French tasting plate. A foie gras terrine with pomegranate glaze. "This is cuisine," Marcus said. "This is precision, balance, skill." He glanced at Keanu again. "Not to knock your tomato rice bowl," he added with a smirk. Keanu offered no reply. His gaze, however, remained unchanged, steady and quiet, like someone who had heard this kind of arrogance before. The tension was subtle, but those paying attention could feel it. It was in the way Keanu's breathing slowed, in the way he hadn't moved since Marcus started talking. and in the way the room itself had begun to listen differently. Miranda tried to pivot the conversation, directing the attention to the next dish on the table. A small board of jamón ibérico, sliced paper thin, accompanied by pan con tomate. She smiled at the audience. Our next tasting celebrates two staples of Spanish culture: aged ham and rustic tomato bread, both served in family homes and fine restaurants across Spain. Marcus, care to weigh in? Marcus didn't hesitate. Iberian ham is perhaps the greatest marketing triumph in food history, he said, plucking a slice with a pair of tongs. Yes, it melts on the tongue. Yes, it comes from pigs that eat acorns. But let's be honest, it's cured meat, dressed up with a romantic backstory. He chewed slowly, deliberately. Is it good? Sure. Is it exceptional? Not by any standard that values innovation or technique. It's a product of time, not talent. He turned toward Keanu again. I bet you love this stuff, don't you? He asked, almost teasing. You seem like the kind of man who'd find meaning in every bite. Keanu didn't respond immediately. His eyes drifted down to the table for a moment, then returned to Marcus. I've had jamón ibérico, he said quietly, and I remember who I shared it with. Marcus leaned back in his chair and gave an exaggerated shrug. See, sentiment again. That's what Spanish food runs on. Memories, feelings, not mastery. Miranda stiffened in her seat. She wasn't sure if the cameras were capturing the tension clearly, but something had shifted in the studio. The laughter from the audience had stopped. The warmth in Marcus's tone had gone cold. This wasn't witty banter anymore. It was something sharper. Marcus turned his attention to the pan con tomate, holding it between his fingers like it might offend him. Read. Tomato, oil, he said, inspecting the slice like it was a joke. 3 ingredients, and half the world treats it like sacred art. You know what this is? An accident. A convenient snack that people retroactively assigned meaning to. He took a bite, barely chewing before placing it down. It's fine, but let's stop pretending it belongs in conversations about culinary excellence. The camera cut to Keanu again. He remained unmoved. But those who knew him, those who'd followed his interviews, his charity work, his time off grid, would have recognized something else beneath the silence. It was the kind of stillness that comes before a wave. Marcus wasn't finished. He gestured broadly at the display of Spanish flavors. The problem isn't that these dishes exist. The problem is the pedestal we put them on. Spain hasn't evolved. They've coasted on nostalgia. And tourists lap it up because they think rustic equals real. Then, looking once again at Keanu, he added with mock sincerity, "But I'm sure your experiences were magical." The audience didn't laugh this time. They waited. So did Keanu. But not for long. Miranda attempted to steer the conversation back into safer territory, sensing the unease spreading through the studio. "Marcus," she said, her tone light, "you've certainly sparked some strong reactions with your opinions on Spanish cuisine. But don't you think there's something to be said for the cultural significance behind these dishes?" Marcus laughed, a short, smug sound. "Cultural significance," he repeated, waving a hand. "That's what we say when food isn't good enough to stand on its own. Look, I respect tradition, but let's not confuse heritage with excellence. Spanish cuisine is charming, sure, but only because it reminds people of something, not because it does anything remarkable." He leaned forward, locking eyes with Keanu. I mean, Keanu's been to Spain. He's probably sipped red wine under a sunset and decided it was the best thing he ever tasted. But that's not about the wine. That's about the sunset. There it was again, the dismissal. Not just of the food, but of meaning, of experience. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged, but his hands had stilled entirely. They no longer fidgeted, no longer moved with the rhythm of the discussion. They rested calmly on the table, as if bracing for something. Marcus kept going, unaware that he was drifting into deeper, more dangerous waters. "The truth is, Spanish cuisine is simple because it has to be. Their ingredients are limited, their techniques are outdated, and their obsession with preserving the past has made them resistant to progress. He turned back to Miranda. They're more interested in rituals than results. The silence in the room grew. Keanu's gaze had not shifted, but his breathing had slowed. Not from discomfort, from intention. Miranda saw it, the crew felt it, even the audience, sitting silently under the lights, could tell the atmosphere had changed. The light-hearted culinary conversation had transformed into something more pointed, more personal. And Marcus, blinded by his own certainty, was too enthralled with the sound of his own voice to realize it. "I mean," Marcus said, gesturing again to Keanu with casual condescension, "you've traveled, you know how it goes. A warm village, a sentimental meal, some tears over stew. That's lovely, but it's not cooking. It's therapy." He laughed at his own line. Nobody else did. Keanu's eyes were steady, still silent, still waiting. Miranda turned toward him, unsure of how much longer he would remain silent. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat. It was almost imperceptible, but it changed everything. Because Marcus had confused quiet with consent, stillness with surrender. What he didn't realize was that the man sitting across from him hadn't come to argue. He had come carrying something older, something deeper, and something much stronger than the applause Marcus craved. And for the first time all evening, Keanu spoke. Just one sentence. Low, calm, and clear. "I've had a different experience of Spain." The studio hung on Keanu's quiet sentence like it was a chord struck on a still piano. "I've had a different experience of Spain." His tone wasn't defensive. It wasn't even confrontational, but it carried a depth that forced a shift in the room. Even Marcus blinked, slightly taken aback. It was the first real resistance he'd met all evening. Miranda leaned forward, sensing the shift. "Would you like to share more about that, Keanu?" Marcus waved dismissively, cutting her off before Keanu could answer. No, hold on," he said, recovering his swagger. "Let's not derail the segment with romantic detours. I get it. You went to Spain, you had a spiritual awakening, a lovely woman in a shawl made you a stew, but that doesn't change what Spanish cuisine is, fundamentally." He looked back at the audience, using his palms to frame the air around him. "This entire cuisine is built on nostalgia. They've romanticized scarcity, bread with tomato, rice with bits of fish, cold soup from old vegetables. It's wartime food dressed up in family stories." The audience shifted in their seats. The murmurs were beginning. People weren't laughing anymore. They were trying to understand where the line had been crossed. Marcus didn't notice. "Spain," he continued, "has built an empire of culinary sentiment. It's a country that celebrates poverty by calling it tradition. You don't evolve when you're too busy trying to immortalize every grandmother's pantry." Miranda raised her hand gently. "Marcus," she said, "I think we may be veering into—" He cut her off. "This is the problem. We're so afraid to speak plainly about food. Spanish cuisine isn't brave or inventive. It's comfortable. It's passive. It's curated to appeal to tourists who want to feel like they're having an authentic experience without ever challenging their palate." He pointed to the audience now. "How many of you have posted pictures of paella on Instagram? Of sangria in the sun? You know what you're tasting? A marketing campaign. That's what Spanish cuisine is now. Marketed mediocrity." Several people looked down. One woman in the front row crossed her arms and frowned. Miranda glanced at Keanu. He was still, but the change in his expression was visible. His jaw had tensed ever so slightly. His breath, previously calm and rhythmic, had shortened. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to register with anyone truly watching. He didn't interrupt. He didn't protest. But something had shifted again. Marcus smiled as if he had delivered a masterclass in clarity. "Look, I respect the country," he said, his voice softening just enough to seem reasonable. "But we have to stop pretending that being poor with style is the same as being great. Spanish food is limited, and celebrating that limitation doesn't make it profound, it makes it delusional. The word landed like a slap. Across the room, even the crew looked stunned. And Keanu sat with his hands in his lap, breathing in through his nose, out through his mouth, remembering a different Spain, one that Marcus had never seen. Marcus continued, fueled by his own momentum. His words, once witty and provocative, were now veering into dangerous territory. He seemed unaware of the shift in tone, unaware that what had once been playful jabs had become something sharper, more cutting, more cruel. I mean, how many ways can you prepare sardines and call it a regional masterpiece? He asked, chuckling as if the answer was obvious. They serve it with lemon and call it an experience. Put it on a wooden plate and suddenly it's art. But in any serious culinary tradition, that's a garnish, not a course. He leaned back, speaking now like a professor addressing a room of students. You see, what Spain has done, brilliantly, I'll admit, is convince the world that simplicity equals purity, that effortlessness is virtue. But the truth is, they've institutionalized mediocrity and wrapped it in folklore. The audience had grown silent. No laughter now, just quiet discomfort. Miranda attempted once more to steer things back. Marcus, while I understand you're critiquing from a professional standpoint, do you think there might be value in how these dishes preserve memory and connection? He smiled thinly. That's the problem, Miranda. We've mistaken memory for meaning. Food should evolve, it should challenge, not hide behind tradition like a security blanket. Spanish cooking hasn't pushed boundaries, it's just been really good at branding what they already had. You call it heritage, I call it stagnation. Then, without warning, he turned to Keanu again. You know what I think it is? People like Keanu fall in love with the idea of Spain. They go there during some difficult moment in life, they're met with kindness and home-cooked meals, and they mistake that personal warmth for culinary brilliance. He gestured to the display of tasting dishes. Family aren't tasting the food, they're tasting the moment. Keanu looked up slowly. There was no anger in his eyes, no visible frustration, just a stillness that had deepened into something almost immovable. Marcus pressed on. And that's fine, really it is. We all need healing sometimes. But let's not confuse a healing meal with a great one. A warm bowl of soup doesn't make it revolutionary cuisine, it makes it comforting. That's a different standard. He turned to Miranda. I just think we should be honest. Spanish food makes people feel something, but not because of its technique. It's because they associate it with family, with simplicity, with a slower time. That's nostalgia, not quality. The studio was ice quiet. Even the boom mic operators had frozen in place, their equipment still suspended in the air. Keanu's expression hadn't changed, but Miranda noticed his hands. They weren't resting on his knees anymore. They were clasped together, fingers interlocked gently, as if holding something unseen. And for the first time all night, he shifted forward just a little in his seat. No one spoke, but the shift was unmistakable. It wasn't anger. It was readiness. Marcus sat back in his chair, clearly proud of what he believed to be a brilliant dismantling of cultural mythology. He crossed one leg over the other, glanced briefly at the camera feed, and smiled. His confidence was unwavering, built on years of television dominance and applause for precisely this kind of performance. Miranda, however, didn't return the smile. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her cue cards now forgotten in her hand. She looked toward the control booth where even the director seemed uncertain. They all knew what had just happened, even if Marcus didn't. He hadn't just insulted a cuisine. He had insulted a people. And Keanu, still silent, had heard every word. There was something weighty in the air now, a kind of pressure that made people lean forward in their seats without realizing it. Viewers at home would later describe the moment as eerie, as if time paused between Marcus's last sentence and whatever would come next. Keanu took in a breath, slow and steady. He glanced down briefly at the table, then at the untouched plate of pan con tomate in front of him. The tomato had started to darken at the edges. The oil glistened under the studio lights. A simple slice of bread. And yet, to him, it wasn't simple at all. His fingers moved to the edge of his jacket pocket, where Carmen's recipe still rested. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, he looked up at Marcus and said nothing. The silence stretched, longer than television is comfortable with, but no one rushed to fill it. Not Miranda, not the crew, not even Marcus, because something was happening. Something they all felt, but couldn't explain. Keanu wasn't reacting. He was preparing. Marcus, sensing that his dominance was slipping, chuckled nervously. "Look, Keanu, I get it," he said. "You have your stories, your quiet little moments with locals who cooked for you when you were in a rough place. That's beautiful, man, really. But personal experience isn't the same as professional perspective. Emotion doesn't make food good." Keanu tilted his head slightly. Still no words. Just breath. Just wait. The studio lights buzzed quietly overhead. Someone in the audience cleared their throat. Marcus leaned in again, trying to recover the rhythm he'd lost. "You can't build an argument on feelings. Spain's cuisine is built on scarcity, on leftovers, on making do with less. It's a culinary survival kit. And now we're all supposed to pretend it's art?" Miranda turned to Keanu. Her voice was soft. "Do you have something you'd like to say?" He blinked once, then nodded. Just once. And finally Keanu Reeves spoke. Not loud, not fast, but with a calm that quieted everything else in the room. He said, "You've misunderstood what makes something meaningful." And in that moment, every person watching, on set, in the audience, and across the world, knew the conversation had changed. This wasn't about food anymore. It was about truth. Keanu sat forward slightly, his hands resting loosely in his lap. His voice didn't rise, it didn't harden, but the weight in it shifted something in the room. The tone was no longer reactive. It was reflective, like someone slowly pulling back the curtain on something deeply personal. He looked at Marcus with calm eyes. "Let me tell you a story," Keanu said, "about an old woman named Carmen Vasquez." Marcus leaned back, arms crossed. The audience leaned forward. "She lives in Seville," Keanu continued. "She's 84, widowed since 1975. She raised 4 children on her own after her husband died during the final years of Franco's dictatorship. She worked 16-hour days in a textile factory, and every night she came home and cooked dinner." He paused for a moment, letting the words settle. She didn't do it for tradition. She didn't do it for nostalgia. She did it so her children had something warm to eat, something to hold on to when the rest of the world felt uncertain. The studio was silent. "I met Carmen 2 years ago," Keanu said, his voice quieter now. "Not as an actor, not as a tourist, as a broken man. I had just lost someone I loved. I was tired, raw, and barely eating. I was in Spain because I didn't know where else to be. I ended up in a small neighborhood outside Seville, and someone kind introduced me to Carmen." He looked down for a moment, then continued. "She didn't speak much English. My Spanish was worse, but she took one look at me and knew I was grieving. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer advice. She brought me into her kitchen, and she showed me how to make gazpacho." He smiled, just barely. Not as a recipe, not as performance, as ritual. He let the silence breathe for a few seconds. "She taught me how to peel the tomatoes by hand, how to soak the stale bread in cold water, not too long, not too short, how to add garlic and olive oil, a little vinegar, and to blend slowly. She didn't measure anything. She listened to the texture. She watched the color. She tasted. She waited." The audience listened without blinking. "That soup saved my appetite, but more than that, it reminded me what care looks like, what patience feels like. Carmen didn't talk about her pain, but I could taste it. I could feel the years in the way she moved, the way her hands guided mine." He paused again, blinking once. She didn't ask me to honor her. She didn't say anything profound. She just sat across from me when it was done and shared a bowl of gazpacho. It was the first meal I've finished in weeks. Marcus didn't speak. Miranda looked away briefly, her throat tight. Keanu looked at the plate of untouched tomato bread on the table, and then he said, "That's where Spanish food begins." Keanu's voice remained quiet, steady. After a few days in Carmen's kitchen, I started eating again. I started sleeping. She didn't talk much about herself, but I learned things by watching her. She would stop stirring the soup to wipe down the same countertop 3 times, not because it needed cleaning, but because her hands needed something to do. Something steady. He looked up at the studio lights but didn't seem to notice them. He told me once, very slowly, in Spanish, that she had made that gazpacho recipe over 2,000 times. She had made it during blackouts, during floods, during layoffs. She had made it with bruised tomatoes, with stale bread, with garlic so old she had to scrape away the mold. She made it not because it was fancy, but because it worked. He turned to Marcus now. "And you call that limited?" Marcus flinched, just barely. Keanu didn't push. He just let the words land. "It wasn't long after that," he continued, "that I traveled to Barcelona. A friend there introduced me to the Mendoza family. They ran a small restaurant out of the back of their house. No website, no sign, just a hand-painted menu and a courtyard full of mismatched chairs." He smiled a little at the memory. "Maybe invited me to stay for dinner? I thought I was just passing through. I ended up staying 3 weeks. The audience chuckled softly, not out of amusement, but recognition. Belia were preparing a paella that night. Not the version most people get at restaurants. Not the version with shrimp and bright colors for the tourists. The real thing, Valencia style. Rabbit, snails, artichokes, it took hours. He glanced toward the table again. Señor Mendoza was a retired fisherman. He had hands like stone and moved like he was carrying the sea in his shoulders. He told me, in perfect Catalan, that paella was never about the recipe. It was about the ritual. Keanu's tone deepened with memory. He said, "Paella is how we slow time, how we remind ourselves to stay at the table." A few people in the audience exhaled, almost involuntarily. I watched them cook. I watched them wait. They talked while the rice absorbed the broth. They told stories. They remembered people they missed. They laughed without hurrying. He looked up again, this time directly at Marcus. And when it was done, we ate together. Slowly, with our fingers sometimes, with wine poured from a bottle that had dust on it from years of waiting. He paused. That was the first time I understood that food isn't about innovation, it's about presence. Marcus said nothing. Miranda didn't move. Keanu leaned back slightly, but his voice didn't lose its center. "You called it peasant food. I call it survival made sacred." The audience stayed silent, not out of discomfort, but reverence. Keanu wasn't defending Spain. He was remembering it, and every word he spoke made it harder to argue with him. Keanu's voice softened again, as if he were speaking less to Marcus now and more to someone unseen. Some afternoon, during my last week in Barcelona, I helped the Mendozas prepare the sofrito. Just onions, tomatoes, garlic, oil. Simple. I was stirring it too fast, and Señora Mendoza stopped me. She touched my hand and said, No, despacio, slow. If you rush the base, the rest." He nodded once, quietly. Never forgot that. Because she wasn't just talking about cooking, she was talking about healing. He looked up, letting the silence breathe. The paella that night wasn't perfect. The fire got too hot, and part of the bottom burned, but no one complained. No one sent it back. Because they weren't there for the presentation. They were there to be together. The char on the rice? That became the story we told the next night. That's what food does. It carries memory, not just flavor. He exhaled slowly. "You say Spanish cuisine is limited. I say it's layered. You say it lacks innovation. I say it carries centuries. You say it's for tourists. I say it saved my life." The audience had stopped shifting in their seats. No one reached for their phones. No one coughed. It was as if the entire room had agreed to listen all the way through. Keanu turned his gaze back toward Marcus. Not aggressive, not triumphant, just clear. "You've mistaken performance for purpose, complexity for depth, showmanship for care." He let the words hang. Carmen didn't measure anything, but every bowl of gazpacho she made was exactly right. The Mendozas didn't speak English, but I understood everything they were saying when they handed me a plate. Because some things are more honest than language. Miranda's eyes glistened slightly, though she said nothing. Keanu folded his hands again and looked down at the table. "I carry Carmen's recipe with me. It's in my jacket right now. It's not written in a cookbook. It's scribbled on the back of a paper menu, in her handwriting. She gave it to me the morning I left. I didn't ask for it. She just pressed it into my palm and said, 'This is for when you forget how to begin again.'" His voice caught briefly. He cleared it and continued. "So, when you say Spanish food is just bread and tomatoes, or rice and whatever's left in the fridge, I understand why. You've never needed it to be more than that." He looked up again. "But some of us have." Marcus didn't move. His mouth was slightly open, but no words came. And Keanu, still calm, still grounded, finished with a whisper that carried further than any shout. "Some of us were kept alive by those meals." And with that, he leaned back in his chair. Nothing more to prove, because he hadn't just described food. He had described home. Marcus finally leaned forward, breaking the silence with a smirk that had lost some of its shine. "That was touching," he said. "Truly, and I mean that. It was beautiful. But here's the thing, sentiment is not sophistication." The phrase landed like he expected it to. A final blow, a declaration of victory. The words echoed briefly in the studio. Sentiment is not sophistication. He said it like a thesis, like a mic drop. But the only sound that followed was the quiet hum of stage lights overhead. The camera turned to Keanu, zooming in slowly. His expression didn't change, but the stillness deepened. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of something gathering. And then Keanu spoke. His voice low, measured, unshaken. "Carmen Vasquez taught me to make gazpacho in her kitchen in Seville." That was all he said. And everything he said, the studio froze. Marcus blinked, as if trying to process the weight behind the sentence. He had expected pushback. He had expected resistance. But he hadn't expected this. Not a comeback. A memory. A name. Miranda's hand instinctively dropped the cue card in her lap. She didn't need it anymore. Everyone in the room felt it. The temperature shift. The emotional tide pulling away from performance and into something deeper. This wasn't an argument now. This was something else entirely. Keanu didn't look at Marcus when he said her name. He looked at the space in front of him as if Carmen was standing there, as if she mattered more than the show. She was 84, he continued, now directing his voice to no one and everyone at once. She had seen civil war, dictatorship, widowed young, worked her hands until they cracked. But she still made time to teach a stranger how to make a meal. His voice wasn't emotional. It was respectful. Still, like standing in a church. He didn't talk about innovation or plating. She didn't talk about technique. She talked about what she remembered. What her mother did. What she smelled in the mornings when she was a girl. He turned to Marcus, finally meeting his eyes. That's not sentiment. That's survival. That's wisdom. The audience didn't move. No murmurs. No shifting. Just breath. Keanu continued. And the first spoonful I had, when it hit my tongue, I didn't taste tomatoes. I tasted her silence, her strength, the heat she had walked through, the grief she carried in her chest, the years. He sat back slightly in his chair. That was the most sophisticated thing I've ever tasted. Marcus tried to speak, but nothing came out, because in that moment, even he knew. This wasn't about cuisine anymore. It was about something he hadn't touched, and something he couldn't. Keanu didn't rush. He allowed the silence to stay with them, let the weight of his words settle in the space that Marcus had tried to fill with noise. He looked down briefly, remembering something. "I asked Carmen once why she still cooked everything from scratch," Keanu said. "Why she wouldn't just buy pre-made broth or bottled tomato juice. She could barely walk to the market, and her arthritis made it hard to chop." He paused and then looked back up, a faint smile on his lips. "Sheen told me, if I stop doing it with my hands, I'll forget why it matters." The room was so quiet it almost felt suspended in time. Keanu leaned in slightly, and that stayed with me. Because what she was really saying was, if she let convenience take over, she'd lose the connection. The connection to where she came from, to her mother, to her children, to her own worth. His voice remained steady. "You talk about technique, about complexity. But I've sat at tables where the only technique was hunger, and the only complexity was grief, and somehow the food was still perfect." The audience stirred, some blinking faster, others holding back emotion they didn't expect to feel in a televised cooking segment. Keanu glanced at the tasting plates again. "The dishes in front of us aren't just ingredients," he said. "They're stories." Carmen's gazpacho was her way of remembering, of continuing. And when she shared it with me, it became part of my story too. He turned back to Marcus. "You say sentiment isn't sophistication, but maybe you've confused sophistication with performance. Maybe sophistication isn't about how clever your technique is. Maybe it's about how deeply you understand what the food means." Marcus still hadn't spoken. His smirk was gone. His confidence had faded into something more like hesitation. Keanu didn't take advantage of it. He didn't gloat. He just kept telling the truth. "I've eaten at places with Michelin stars. I've tasted foam and smoke and gold leaf. I've been served dishes on glass and marble by people who talked about flavor profiles like symphonies." He nodded slowly. "Some of those meals were extraordinary, but none of them gave me back my appetite the way Carmen's soup did." Now Miranda was sitting forward, hands clasped tightly in her lap, visibly moved. The audience was motionless. The cameras were still rolling, but even the crew behind them had forgotten the script. Keanu's voice lowered one final time. "She didn't feed me to impress me. She fed me because I looked empty." And then, without raising his voice, he said the sentence that shifted the entire energy in the room. "And that is the most sophisticated thing one human being can do for another." He stopped speaking, not because he was finished, but because nothing more needed to be said in that moment. Marcus finally shifted in his chair. His eyes darted from Keanu to Miranda to the audience and back. For once, he didn't have a soundbite ready, no witty comeback, no smug dismissal. The studio felt different now. No longer a stage, but something quieter, closer to a sacred space. He leaned forward slightly, as if to speak, but stopped himself. Keanu didn't press. He didn't need to. The point wasn't to win. It was to remind. Miranda cleared her throat gently, her voice softer than before. "Keanu, thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of people needed to hear that." He nodded once. "Thank you." There was a pause. One of those rare moments in television where silence wasn't awkward, but earned. Then Marcus finally spoke. "Look," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I don't mean to disrespect your experience. I genuinely don't. And what you described, I can see why it mattered to you." Keanu nodded, gracious but still grounded. "I guess I just approach food differently," Marcus continued, clearly trying to find his footing again. "To me, it's about pushing boundaries, refining everything to its most elegant form." Keanu didn't interrupt. He let him speak. "But maybe," Marcus added after a long pause, "maybe there's more to it than that." The audience remained silent, not from awkwardness, but from reverence. Keanu offered a small smile. There's room for all of it: technique, innovation, and memory. Marcus nodded slowly. Miranda stepped in, gently guiding the moment back to center. We started this segment talking about international fusion, she said, her voice steadier now, but maybe the most powerful fusion we've seen tonight is the fusion of experience and empathy. A soft ripple of applause broke out from the audience. Small at first, then building. Not thunderous, but warm. Earnest. Marcus looked down at the table in front of him. For the first time, he reached for the pan con tomate. He didn't make a comment. He didn't joke. He just took a bite and chewed slowly. When he looked back up, his eyes met Keanu's. I think I understand a little better now, he said. I may have been missing something. Keanu didn't say anything. He just nodded, as if to say, that's enough. The cameras continued rolling, but it no longer felt like television. It felt like a room full of people who had learned something together, through story, through silence, through honesty. Miranda looked into the lens. We'll be right back after the break. But even as the music played and the lights shifted, no one in the studio moved for a few moments longer, because something had shifted for good. Marcus Thornfield had delivered what he thought was the final blow. But instead, he'd opened the door to something deeper. And Keanu Reeves had walked through it, carrying nothing but a memory and the truth. Keanu looked down at his hands for a long moment, then back up. His voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. But the way he spoke had changed. It had become even quieter, even clearer. Like someone reading a letter written long ago, not for an audience, but for someone they loved. Carmen's kitchen was small, he began. 2 narrow counters, 1 gas burner that flickered when the wind blew through the old window above it. The tiles on the wall were cracked in places, and there was a small table with a white lace cloth that had been patched more times than I could count. He smiled faintly. She kept a ceramic jar of olive oil next to the stove. Not fancy, not imported. Just local oil from a neighbor's grove. She told me the bottle was older than I was, and she reused it every year. That was Carmen. The audience sat absolutely still. She was born in 1939, the same year the Spanish Civil War ended. Her earliest memories weren't of toys or songs. They were of ration lines, bread cards, the sound of grown men speaking in whispers because it wasn't safe to speak loudly. Keanu paused, not for effect, but to honor what came next. Jean was the second of 6 children. Her father died when she was 10. Her mother worked as a washerwoman, sometimes 14 hours a day. Carmen left school at 12 and started cooking because someone had to. She never saw it as talent. She saw it as necessity. He looked toward the audience now, as if speaking directly to them. When I met her, she moved like someone who had been doing the same sacred dance for decades. There was no rush in her steps, no fear of wasting time. Every motion had meaning. She washed tomatoes like she was blessing them. She stirred broth like she was calming a child. A few people in the audience lowered their heads. She didn't own a cookbook. She didn't write down her recipes until I asked her to. And even then, she apologized. She said, "It will never taste the same unless you feel the day." I didn't understand what she meant at first. Keanu folded his hands together gently. But over time, I did. I started to notice the way she would wait an extra minute before turning off the stove just because the wind outside had changed. Or the way she could taste the difference between peppers grown in different soil without ever needing to look at a label. His voice didn't rise, but every word landed with more force than before. That wasn't sentiment, that was memory, that was discipline. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't even shift. Keanu continued softly. Sheem told me one afternoon, "We didn't cook to impress anyone. We cooked so that no one in the family would feel forgotten." He paused, and somehow that made me feel remembered. Keanu's voice took on a tone that was almost reverent. She had these hands, he said slowly, small but strong, the kind of hands that could slice garlic paper thin without looking down. Her knuckles were swollen from decades of use, but when she held a knife, it was like watching someone perform a prayer. He glanced down at his own palms. He showed me how to press tomatoes through a sieve, not a blender, a sieve. She said a machine was too loud, too fast, that it broke the flavor, that if you couldn't feel the food breaking down under your pressure, you wouldn't understand when to stop. He looked up, and the room was breathless. There was one afternoon, Keanu continued, when I was struggling to hold myself together. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. Carmen didn't ask why. She didn't say a word. She just handed me a cutting board, handed me a knife, and pointed to the pile of ripe tomatoes. His breath caught for a moment. I started cutting, badly, too fast. I was slicing through them like I was trying to get it over with. She stopped me, put her hand on my wrist, and she said, "No estás aquí." You are not here. He let the words sit. She wasn't just talking about the kitchen. She could see I wasn't present. I was somewhere else. In the past. In the pain. He closed his eyes briefly. She minded my hands back to the tomatoes, showed me how to cut slowly, how to let the scent rise as I worked. She said, "You come back to yourself through your hands." That was Carmen. A few people in the audience were visibly emotional now. She never once tried to explain Spain to me. She never gave me a tour, never offered opinions about culture or history. She just cooked. Every day, even when her knees ached, even when her back stiffened so badly she had to lean on the counter to stay upright. He spoke with a quiet rhythm, each word deliberate. Palm night, after dinner, we sat in her kitchen and she told me how she had survived the worst winter of her life. Franco had cut supply lines to parts of the country. Her children were coughing from the cold. She had no meat, no dairy. She fed them bread soaked in water and oil. She told them it was soup. They didn't know any better, they just felt warm. Keanu's eyes began to glisten. And she said, "That's when I knew food was more than food. It's a promise. If you're still eating, you're still here." The room had gone beyond stillness now. It felt sacred. Marcus didn't even blink. Miranda hadn't touched her cards in minutes. Keanu, speaking only from memory, said, "Carmen didn't just keep her family alive. She kept them believing there would be a tomorrow. And then, softly, she did the same for me." Keanu glanced at the table in front of him. One of the tasting plates still held a small bowl of gazpacho, untouched. He reached out and gently pulled it closer. "He made this every week," he said, "even when there were only 2 tomatoes left in the kitchen, even when she had no energy. Not for the flavor, but for the rhythm. It grounded her. It reminded her she still had something to give." He didn't lift the spoon. He just looked at it for a moment. Carmen told me she had lost her appetite once, after her husband passed. For weeks, she couldn't eat. Everything tasted like salt and dust. But her neighbor came over one night, placed a bowl of gazpacho on her table and said, "Start here." Keanu looked at Marcus again. His tone never shifted from that calm, reflective place. "That's what Carmen gave to me. A place to start, not because I was special, not because I deserved it, but because I was in front of her. And because, in her world, no one eats alone." He finally looked back at Miranda. "Those weeks I spent in her kitchen, they weren't about food, they were about time. About the quiet repetition of tasks that slowly brought me back to the present." The audience listened like they were sitting in Carmen's kitchen themselves. Every day we made something small. Soup, tortilla, bread. She didn't own measuring cups. She measured with her eyes, her hands, her memory. She once told me, "When you've made the same thing for 40 years, the recipe moves inside you." He smiled gently, and she meant it. I watched her catch a burn before it happened, stir a sauce before it stuck, taste broth with a fingertip and know exactly what was missing. Keanu leaned back slightly. That's not nostalgia, that's mastery. Marcus looked like he wanted to respond, but the words wouldn't come. There's a power in that kind of simplicity, Keanu continued. Not everyone sees it, especially not in a world where flash and speed get all the attention. But Carmen's food, her way, wasn't designed to impress. It was designed to hold people together. Miranda exhaled slowly, as if she'd forgotten to breathe. Keanu nodded, finishing what he had come to say. When I left, she pressed that recipe into my hand. Gazpacho. In her handwriting. It wasn't clean. It had a smudge of tomato on one corner. She didn't call it a gift. She just said, in case someone else comes to your table who forgets how to eat. He paused, and I've kept it with me ever since. The audience didn't applaud. They didn't speak. They didn't move. Not yet, because everyone in that studio understood. Keanu hadn't just told a story. He had brought them into someone's kitchen, and in doing so reminded them all what food, what care, was truly for. Keanu sat quietly for a moment, collecting the memory before offering it to the room. His voice dropped slightly, as if he were returning to that quiet kitchen in Seville, not just in his mind, but in spirit. There was one evening, he said, about 10 days after I arrived at Carmen's. It had been a long day. I had barely spoken. I was still sleeping in 3-hour windows, still walking like someone waiting for gravity to finish what loss had started. He rested his hands on the table gently. I sat at her table. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't talk at all that night. She just cooked. Gazpacho again, pan con aceite, a little bit of cheese, and a single glass of red wine. She set the food in front of me like it wasn't a question. He paused, and I stared at it for a long time, because I hadn't eaten more than half a sandwich in almost a week. My stomach had forgotten what hunger felt like. Everything tasted like paper. But that night, I don't know. Something shifted. He looked down, his voice slowing with reverence. I picked up the spoon. I took a bite. Cold, smooth, bright with acid, but gentle. The kind of cold that reminds you you're still alive. The kind of flavor that asks nothing of you, but stays with you anyway. He nodded slowly, and I kept eating, bite after bite. I didn't realize it, but Carmen had sat down across from me. She wasn't eating. She was just watching, quietly, like she knew exactly what that moment meant. He looked up, and halfway through the bowl, I realized I wasn't just eating soup. I was letting someone take care of me, maybe for the first time in months. The audience didn't move. Miranda looked stunned, her hands clasped together, pressed against her lips. Keanu continued. I finished everything she served. The soup, the bread, the cheese, even the wine. And when I looked up, I didn't say anything. I just nodded. And she smiled. That small, wrinkled smile that said, "Good, you're back now." He paused for a breath. And I cried. Not loudly, not like in the movies, just a few quiet tears. Because that meal didn't taste like food. It tasted like permission. Like someone saying, "You're allowed to stay." He folded his hands gently again. That's what Spanish food gave me. Not flavors, not fireworks, just presence, just a return to myself. Then he looked back toward Marcus. You called it limited, she called it survival. Marcus sat, frozen, the words hitting harder than any insult could have. He had called Spanish food rustic, unsophisticated, nostalgic. But he hadn't understood the weight that simplicity could carry. Keanu's voice remained calm. It's not about invention, it's about attention. It's about knowing that when someone sits at your table, they are trusting you with something fragile. And Carmen never broke that trust. Not once. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting on the rim of the empty bowl in front of him. The lighting in the studio seemed softer now, like the air itself was holding still to listen. He told me, he said, If a dish only works in a restaurant, it's not a dish. It's a performance. He let that linger. Carmen believed food wasn't made to dazzle, it was made to anchor. She'd say, "The right meal should make you breathe slower," and I never understood that until that night. It gestured gently with one hand. The meal, it gave me more than nourishment. It gave me rhythm, breath, a small sacred act that connected me to the present. And every time she served food, she was giving a part of herself, a story, a history. He looked over at Miranda, whose eyes were now visibly wet. That night, after I finished, she wiped the table slowly with a cloth that had belonged to her mother. She didn't rush. She didn't speak. She just cleaned in wide, patient circles. And I remember watching her hands and realizing this is what it means to serve with love. Keanu's voice quieted but never broke. I went to Spain to hide, to grieve, to disappear, and I ended up finding something far deeper than I ever expected. I found dignity. Not mine, hers. The kind that doesn't ask for attention. The kind that exists in the everyday. He pointed gently toward the word technical that Marcus had earlier used. We use that word a lot. Technical, sophisticated, precise. But precision without love is just noise. Carmen's gazpacho wasn't perfect by Michelin standards, but it was made by someone who had buried a husband, raised children alone, endured food shortages, and still had the grace to feed a stranger like me. The audience was silent, moved, changed. Keanu turned back toward Marcus. You dismissed what you didn't understand. You mocked flavors born from hardship, from community, from memory. But when Carmen cooked for me, she wasn't showcasing Spain. She was giving me a reason to stay alive. Marcus looked stunned, like the words were cutting through the last of his smug detachment. Keanu sat quietly for a beat, letting the truth settle like dust in sunlight. She never once called herself a chef. She said, "I'm just a woman who still believes a warm plate can soften grief." He looked around the room, and she was right. Then he glanced at the old recipe card still tucked in his pocket, his voice softening to a final note. So when I hear someone call her food unsophisticated, I don't feel offended. I feel sad. Sad for the people who will never sit at a table like hers, who will never taste care, real care, cooked into every bite. Sad for those who confuse spectacle with substance. And then, his final line, because sometimes the most extraordinary meals are made with the least and mean the most. There was no applause, just breathless silence, the kind that only follows truth. The silence in the studio lingered longer than anyone expected, but Marcus Thornfield couldn't sit still in it. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his lapel mic, clearing his throat more loudly than needed. The tension had turned on him, and he felt it in every inch of his skin. He forced a chuckle, trying to sound amused. "Well," he said, his voice too bright, "that was certainly heartfelt." There were no laughs. No one followed his lead. Marcus tried again. "I mean, look, it's a beautiful story, truly. Carmen sounds like a saint. But with all due respect, this is a cooking competition. It's not a memoir. Food, at this level, isn't about feelings, it's about execution." Still no reaction. Even Miranda kept her eyes on Keanu, refusing to offer Marcus an escape. Marcus frowned, tapping his pen against the recipe card in front of him. "And let's be honest," he continued, "we're talking about a cuisine that, while full of charm and rustic flair, is not exactly known for pushing culinary boundaries." He turned slightly to address the audience. "Spanish food isn't complex, it's peasant-based, rooted in repetition. It lacks the layers of technique you see in French sauces or Japanese knife work. It's limited, nostalgic, sure, but not progressive." The words hit the air like brittle glass. Some in the audience shifted in their seats. One woman in the third row shook her head. Marcus, either unaware or unwilling to stop, pushed on. I mean, come on. Bread with tomatoes? Cold vegetable soup? These are not innovations. They're survival foods, dressed up for tourists who want to feel authentic. It's charming, but it's not mastery. He gestured toward Keanu again. You talk about memory and emotion, and I respect that. But let's not pretend that emotion equals excellence. If it did, every grandmother would have a Michelin star. The audience stirred. Some gasped, others winced. Marcus kept going, and frankly, I find it manipulative, using stories of grief and poverty to elevate dishes that are, let's be honest, basic by modern standards. This isn't a therapy session, it's a cooking show, and food should be judged by its innovation, precision, and technical command, not by who cried into the soup. He folded his arms like he'd landed something powerful, like the silence was now in his favor. But Keanu didn't flinch. He simply looked up, his expression calm, though something new had entered his gaze. Resolve. Keanu spoke quietly, but clearly, the first time his voice cut through with true firmness. Do you know who pioneered molecular gastronomy? Marcus blinked. The shift caught him off guard. Keanu didn't wait for an answer. Do you know where the entire world of foam emulsions, liquid nitrogen plating, deconstructed flavor profiles, do you know where that started? Marcus hesitated, eyes narrowing. France? Keanu shook his head. No. Spain. Catalonia. A few heads in the audience nodded slowly. Marcus faltered. Keanu's voice remained steady. Ferran Adrià, Spanish. Considered one of the most innovative chefs of the modern era. He changed the way the world thinks about texture, temperature, and flavor composition. Marcus looked stunned, his defense visibly cracking. Keanu kept his voice calm, never raising it, but every word carried precision. El Bulli closed in 2011 after winning the title of Best Restaurant in the World 5 times. Its reservation list was a global lottery. Chefs from Tokyo, New York, and Paris flew in just to study how Adrià transformed the simplest Spanish ingredients, olive oil, garlic, tomato, into forms you couldn't even imagine. He looked directly at Marcus. So when you say Spanish cuisine lacks innovation, you're not just wrong. You're erasing the very foundation of what modern haute cuisine has become. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but Keanu gently raised a hand. Just enough to keep the space his. And let's go further, Keanu added. Do you know where sous vide became mainstream? Do you know where the culinary world first began questioning plating as narrative? Where storytelling entered the kitchen not as sentiment, but as structure? Marcus said nothing. Keanu paused. Spain, again, from the Basque Country to Catalonia. Not in spite of their traditions, but because of them. He took a soft breath. You see, Marcus, Carmen's gazpacho and Adrià's deconstructed olive aren't opposites. They're on the same continuum. One preserves history, the other reimagines it, but both begin with the same core values: respect for ingredients, patience, and soul. The audience sat motionless, absorbing the depth of the truth. Miranda finally glanced at the camera crew, who gave her a silent nod that said everything was rolling perfectly. There was no reason to cut. Marcus tried one more angle, his voice quieter now. But isn't there something to be said for scale, for ambition, for cooking that aspires beyond the kitchen table? Keanu nodded thoughtfully. Of course, ambition matters, but so does intention. He tapped his own chest lightly. Carmen never wanted a restaurant. She wanted her children to live. Her food was never meant to impress strangers. It was meant to keep people going. He turned back to Marcus. Not every dish is meant to perform. Some are meant to remember. Some are meant to forgive. And some are meant to heal. That last word landed heavy in the air. Marcus leaned back, visibly shaken. His usual swagger had melted into something like reflection or confusion. Perhaps for the first time in years, He wasn't sure what to say. Keanu leaned forward one last time. You say I'm being emotional. You're right, I am. Because food is emotional. It always has been. It's how we mark our grief. It's how we celebrate our love. It's how we remember who we are. He sat back again. If that's manipulation, then so be it. But I'd rather be moved by a meal than forget it 5 minutes after the plate is cleared. The audience didn't need prompting. They began to applaud, soft at first, then growing louder. It wasn't for spectacle. It wasn't for showmanship. It was for truth. Miranda looked to the producer, who simply gave a thumbs up. Marcus said nothing more, because in that moment, the debate wasn't about cuisine anymore. It was about memory, and Keanu had made sure that everyone in the room would never look at a bowl of soup the same way again. Keanu stayed seated, but his presence now filled the room. There was no aggression in his tone, only clarity, like someone guiding others through a memory he had lived too many times to forget. He looked at Marcus, then back to the camera. You see, Marcus, he began, when you say Spanish cuisine lacks technique, I wonder, have you ever made calcots the right way? Grilled over open flame, wrapped in newspaper to steam, dipped in romesco, made from almonds roasted just right? It takes timing, patience, and restraint. The audience was listening now, like they were in a lecture they never expected to attend. He went on. Have you ever broken down a whole octopus for pulpo alla gallega, cooked it with nothing more than sea salt, smoked paprika, and olive oil, but relied on instinct to know when the texture is perfect? Not rubbery, not mushy, just right? Marcus stayed silent. Keanu continued. You talk about innovation, but let's talk about Joan Roca. 3 Michelin stars. El Celler de Can Roca, Spanish. Known for memory-based tasting menus, his dishes replicate the smell of his mother's laundry, the sweetness of childhood preserves, the sound of his father's bar. A murmur ran through the audience. Or how about Andoni Luis Aduriz, from Mugaritz in the Basque Country? His food isn't just technical, it's philosophical. Dishes served on edible paper with poetry printed on them, a carrot that took 6 months to ferment just right, all born from Spanish culinary culture. Keanu sat still for a moment, letting the names and legacies settle. These aren't just chefs, he said. They're storytellers, scientists, poets, and they all come from the very country you dismissed as nostalgic. He turned his gaze back to Marcus, who was shrinking into his seat now, visibly smaller than the persona he had entered with. And then, Keanu said more softly, there are the ones no one writes about. He held up a single finger. Josefina, a woman in Cadiz who bakes almond tortas at sunrise every day, using her grandmother's wood file oven. No recipe written down, just hands that remember. Other finger, Arturo, a retired fisherman in Galicia, who still salts anchovies on his balcony with the same care his father taught him. A third, and Carmen, who made her own olive oil by pressing fruit she couldn't afford to sell. Keanu paused. They may never receive stars, they may never be interviewed, but they are the backbone of everything we admire in the culinary world. They are the ones who carry technique in their bones. The studio was silent, save for a few sniffles from the front row. Then Keanu asked, Marcus, have you ever cooked for someone grieving? The question struck like a slow bell in a quiet cathedral. Marcus didn't answer. Keanu let it sit. Because when you cook for grief, he said, you're not plating. You're listening. You're listening to the silence at the table. The way someone pushes food around, the way they need the soup hotter than usual just to feel something. You watch, you wait, you adjust. You serve with intention. He leaned forward slightly. That's a technique too, one that can't be taught in culinary school, one that doesn't need tweezers or foam, one that's as old as hunger itself. Keanu sat back, allowing the moment to breathe. No one in the studio moved. He looked at Marcus with a gentleness that wasn't pity. It was something deeper, a quiet kind of invitation to understand. You speak of complexity like it's only found in fusion cuisine, in lab-made components, in plates that require diagrams, Keanu continued. But you can miss the heart of the dish if you're only chasing the mechanics. He tapped the table softly. Pan con tomate. 4 ingredients. Bread, tomato, garlic, olive oil. That's it. But if it's bad bread, the whole thing collapses. If the tomato isn't ripe, it turns bland. If you skip the garlic or use the wrong oil, you lose the balance. He looked toward the audience. It takes more discipline to do something simple perfectly than it does to distract with layers, because when there's nothing to hide behind, you have to be honest. A few heads nodded slowly. One person clapped once, instinctively, then stopped. Keanu smiled slightly, eyes still warm. There's a difference between loud food and lasting food. Loud food performs. Lasting food stays with you. He turned back to Marcus. You've mastered performance. You know how to stun. You can impress judges and dominate headlines. But have you ever made someone cry quietly over a bowl of soup? Not because of what you did with it, but because of what it reminded them of. Marcus swallowed hard, his jaw tense. Keanu didn't wait for an answer. Spanish cuisine doesn't ask to be praised, he said. It asks to be remembered. That's what Carmen taught me. That's what the Mendozas in Barcelona showed me when they let me into their home and made paella. Not in a pan designed for Instagram, but in one blackened by decades of family meals. He took a breath, slow and reflective. And when I told them I had lost someone, they didn't say anything. They just put a plate in front of me. No garnish, no flourish, just warmth, salt, saffron, rice that had absorbed a story. The silence that followed was different now. It was reverent. Keanu leaned in one last time. We live in a time where food is curated more for cameras than for comfort. But there are still places, still people, who understand that the most profound meals don't need applause. They need presence. He folded his hands gently on the table. And presence, Marcus, is the most underrated ingredient in all of cooking. Marcus looked down, then away. Whatever bravado he entered with had been quietly dismantled. Not by humiliation, but by truth. Mirandon glanced toward the producer's booth. No one gave direction. No one needed to. This was no longer a segment. It was a reckoning. Keanu wasn't acting. He wasn't debating. He was remembering. And through that remembrance, he had turned a televised insult into a national conversation on food, dignity, and memory. Keanu looked across the room, his voice low but clear. Sophistication isn't about how rare your ingredients are, he said. It's about knowing how much is enough. He paused, letting the words sink in. The crew, the audience, even Marcus, seemed frozen in place. In Carmen's kitchen, he continued, there were no truffles, no imported sea urchin, no foam, no tweezers, just salt, olive oil, garlic. But every drop of that oil was sacred. Every clove had a purpose. Every tomato was chosen not because it was perfect, but because she knew how to make it sing. He leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on the counter. You can stack 12 elements on a plate and still say nothing. But one slice of jamón ibérico, cut by a steady hand with reverence, speaks louder than a tower of caviar ever could. A hush fell over the room. No one even whispered. Do you know why it's so valuable? Keanu asked, now turning to Marcus. It's not just the breed of the pig. It's the time, the patience, years of acorn feeding, years of air drying, generations of knowledge passed from father to son just to create that one perfect bite. He didn't wait for a response. And yet you call that peasant food? Marcus looked visibly uncomfortable now. His expression had lost its defensive sharpness. It had turned inward. Keanu went on. You want sophistication? Go to La Rioja, he said. Sit with a winemaker whose family has tended the same vines for a century. Watch how they swirl the wine, not for display, but to remember how their father taught them to find balance. They don't brag, they don't rush, they wait. He softened his tone again. And the ritual of pan con tomate. It's not just about rubbing a tomato on bread. It's when you do it, who you share it with, whether the bread is fresh from the market that morning, whether the person you're feeding is tired or laughing or in need of comfort. That's what elevates it. Not technique, not flair. Attention. He looked directly at Marcus again. That's what you don't understand, Keanu said. You don't understand flavor because you've never tasted generosity. The words hit like a quiet wave, slow and deep. Real flavor, he added, is shaped by the hands that offer it. He paused, letting his eyes move across the audience. Carmen would give you the last spoonful even if she hadn't eaten all day. The Mendoza kids would run 2 blocks just to get saffron they couldn't afford, just because they wanted you to taste their best. That's where the flavor comes from, not the ingredient, but the intention. Marcus remained silent, his arms now crossed, but not defiantly, almost as if trying to hold something in. Keanu didn't press. He wasn't trying to win a debate. He was just speaking truth. Sophistication, Keanu said gently, isn't noise. It's knowing when to be quiet. It's choosing simplicity over spectacle. It's creating something so honest that it doesn't need a defense. Keanu's voice didn't waver as he continued. It was the kind of steady that didn't demand attention, but earned it. There's this old man I met in Toledo, he said. Alejandro. He ran a little taberna, tucked behind a stone alleyway. No signs, no menu, just a few stools, a single pan, and whatever he had fresh that day. Keanu smiled softly, as if recalling the scent of something warm. I remember walking in one evening when it had started to rain. I asked him what was on offer, and he handed me a small clay bowl with lentils, a chunk of chorizo, and half a boiled egg. That was it. He paused, and I remember every bite. Because he didn't serve me food, he served me the end of his day, the care he took, the time he spent. That's what I tasted. Not spice, not flair, just presence. He let out a quiet breath. I've eaten in the finest restaurants in the world, he said, his voice still calm, but none of them taught me what Alejandro did in that little taberna. That sophistication isn't a skill, it's a spirit. The camera panned to the audience, eyes glistened, arms crossed over hearts. This wasn't cooking. This was something more sacred. Keanu turned again to Marcus, not confrontational, but grounded. You want to judge food based on precision, he said. But not all cuisine is meant to impress. Some food is just meant to hold you, to carry you when your legs won't. He reached into his jacket pocket. This, he said, carefully unfolding a stained, wrinkled paper, is Carmen's recipe. Not typed, not measured, just notes, little drawings, a smiley face next to the garlic. She didn't write this for show. She wrote it for me, because I asked her how she made her gazpacho taste like home. The audience leaned forward. Skian told me, you have to cry while chopping the onion, not because it stings, but because you remember someone who used to love it. He held the note for a second longer, then placed it flat on the counter beside him. That's what we forget in all our obsession with labels and ratings. We forget that at its heart, cuisine is memory, and memory is sacred. Miranda, the host, wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. The producers didn't dare cut to commercial. Keanu looked into the camera. To the chefs watching this, the home cooks, the grandmothers, the neighbors who make tamales by hand, the bakers up at 4 a.m. kneading dough for strangers, your food matters, even if no one claps, even if no one photographs it. You carry culture. You carry memory. He returned his gaze to Marcus one final time. And if you still think Spanish cuisine is peasant food, maybe it's because you've never known what it feels like to be fed by someone who has nothing, but still gives you everything. Silence. Thick. Keanu didn't smile. He just let the moment land. And for the first time since the cameras rolled, Marcus had nothing left to say. The silence in the studio wasn't awkward, it was reverent. The kind of stillness that arrives when something sacred has been said. Even the camera operators had stopped shifting. One lens was slightly off angle, but no one dared adjust it. The clatter of behind-the-scenes activity had vanished. Lighting crew, production assistants, everyone stood motionless, their eyes fixed on Keanu. Miranda Wells, normally composed and polished, cleared her throat gently. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Keanu," she began, but then stopped. Even she knew this wasn't a moment to redirect. Keanu nodded, acknowledging her with a quiet warmth. He looked down at the wrinkled recipe still resting on the countertop, its creases smoothed flat. Then he looked up and began to speak again. "There was a time in my life," he said slowly, "not long ago, when I couldn't tell what day it was, when the grief was so thick I forgot how to eat. I mean that literally. I would stare at food and feel nothing, taste nothing. Everything was gray." He glanced at Marcus, not accusingly, but to include him in the truth of the story. "That's when I found myself in Spain. Not because I planned to. I was just running. I landed in Seville with no map, no itinerary, just noise in my head and silence in my heart." He touched the paper lightly again. "Carmen found me sitting outside her cafe. I hadn't spoken in hours. She brought me water and a small plate of olives. I didn't even say thank you. I just stared at them like they weren't real." His voice didn't shake, it deepened. She sat down across from me, no introduction, no questions, just presence. Then she said, "It's okay. You don't have to eat today. Just sit with me while I peel garlic." A hush rippled across the room. Even the control room had gone quiet. I came back the next day, and the next, and the next. She never pushed, just invited. Eventually, I chopped an onion. Then I stirred the pot. Then I poured the oil. Then, one afternoon, she handed me a bowl of gazpacho and said, "Now you eat." He looked toward Miranda now, who had tears visibly welling in her eyes. "I hadn't eaten a full meal in days," Keanu said, "but that bowl, that one bowl, tasted like color had returned to the world." No one moved. No one whispered. The studio had transformed. "It wasn't just soup," he continued. "It was dignity. It was warmth. It was someone saying, 'You're not invisible. You matter enough to be fed.'" He turned slightly to the audience, his tone never rising, never falling into performance. "Spanish hospitality isn't about extravagance. It's about soul. It's about giving without asking, sharing without expectation." In that little tiled kitchen, I remembered what it felt like to be human again. The lights above felt softer now, as if they too had been humbled. Marcus sat utterly still. His jaw had slackened. His usual defiance had drained, replaced with something else. Something close to awe, or maybe shame. Keanu let the moment breathe before continuing. "I stayed with Carmen for 2 weeks," Keanu said. "Not because I planned to, but because I couldn't leave. Every day she cooked one dish, just one, a tortilla española, migas with chorizo, lentils with carrots and leeks. Nothing fancy. But every dish had a story, a reason, a memory tied to it." He looked up again, speaking not to Marcus now, but to everyone. "Sheen told me that during the Franco years, food was rationed, meat was rare, olive oil was a luxury, but what they had, bread, onions, tomatoes, garlic, they turned into feasts, because when you feed someone with your heart, it becomes more than sustenance. It becomes survival." The audience remained utterly still, like church pews during a eulogy. Not for someone who died, but for something forgotten and now remembered. Keanu touched the edge of the counter, grounding himself. "I wasn't famous to her," he said. "I wasn't an actor. I was just a man who had forgotten how to feel. And she didn't treat me like a guest. She treated me like someone who deserved to come back to life." Miranda finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "That's beautiful." Keanu nodded, slowly. "I think about her every time I taste tomato and garlic. Not because she gave me a recipe," he said, glancing at the note again, "but because she gave me permission to heal through something as simple as a meal." A sound rose from the audience. It wasn't applause, not yet. It was something gentler, a collective breath, a shared ache. Marcus sat with his arms resting loosely now, head slightly tilted. He looked smaller, not physically, but in posture, like someone seeing something precious for the first time and realizing he'd stepped on it without knowing. Keanu didn't look his way. He didn't need to. "What makes cuisine great isn't the number of steps," he continued, "or the height of the plating. It's the intention behind it. In Spain, they don't rush to impress. They invite you to sit, to listen, to remember that life isn't lived between courses, it's lived in the pauses between bites." He gently closed the recipe note and placed it in his breast pocket again. "And that's why I'm here," he said. "Not to compete, not to perform, but to honor the people who fed me when I couldn't feed myself." The studio lights dimmed slightly, as if responding to the emotional weight. Miranda stood frozen. Then, slowly, she set her cue cards down on the counter. Her fingers trembled slightly as they rested on the table's edge. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, barely audible to the microphones. "You don't have to," Keanu replied, his voice almost a whisper. "Sometimes silence is the best seasoning." The audience didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They simply remained still, honoring what had just been shared. Some closed their eyes, others wiped tears, but no one looked away. Even the crew behind the scenes, camera grips, gaffers, makeup artists, stood in silent witness. Marcus didn't offer a rebuttal. He couldn't, because in that room, at that moment, nothing Keanu said had been for argument. It had been for remembrance. Keanu let the silence linger before stepping forward just slightly. The floor lights shifted with his movement, but he didn't seem to notice. He looked at the crowd, not with intensity, but with gentleness, as if asking permission to say one last thing. "When I think about food," he said, "I don't think about plating. I don't think about ratings or stars or critics." His voice was calm, but it carried weight now, the kind that quiets even internal thoughts. "I think about memory. I think about Carmen Vasquez, her tiny kitchen, the way her hands moved without effort because they had done the work 1,000 times before. I think about the Mendoza family in Barcelona, about how every Sunday they made one pot of paella, not for show, but for each other." He paused and looked directly at Marcus. "You call it peasant food? They called it home." Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, unsure how to respond. Keanu didn't wait for a reply. He turned back toward the audience. "I've eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants. I've seen foam turned into air and gold flakes melted into sauces, but the meal that saved me came in a chipped ceramic bowl in a quiet neighborhood no one ever writes about." He smiled faintly, as if picturing it again. "That bowl of gazpacho wasn't perfect, but it was made with love, and when I took that first bite, I didn't just taste tomato, I tasted care, patience, forgiveness. That's something no culinary school can teach." The audience remained frozen, their eyes reflecting both admiration and something deeper: recognition. "Food," Keanu continued, "isn't just flavor, it's memory, it's identity, it's love made visible." He let the words hang in the air, unhurried. "Some dishes," he added, "are just arrangements. Others are declarations. Spanish cuisine is a declaration that simplicity can be profound, that heritage can be humble and holy at the same time." He turned slightly to Marcus again, not with judgment, but with openness. "You have talent," Keanu said. "No one doubts that. But talent without respect is just noise." Marcus looked at him, his mouth parting slightly, but he didn't speak. Something had changed in him. The certainty was gone. What remained was something closer to reflection. Keanu continued, "You can learn from this," he said gently. "Or cling to your performance. But just know, you walked into a space where history sits at the table, where every olive and anchovy carries a story, where poor families gave the best of what they had, not because it was fashionable, but because it was sacred." The room exhaled collectively. "You called it overrated," Keanu said, his tone still soft. "But maybe what you're really saying is, you didn't understand it." There was no sting, just truth. Miranda's eyes welled again. A few audience members wiped at their faces quietly. Keanu stepped back, giving the moment space. Keanu stood still, letting the final words settle in the air. Then, as if remembering something deeply personal, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded recipe. "This," he said, "was written by Carmen in the corner of her living room. She wrote it on the back of a phone bill because she didn't have any clean paper left." He held it up, not theatrically but carefully. She didn't title it Gazpacho or Andalusian Tomato Blend. She titled it, "For When the World is Too Loud." Miranda gasped softly, a sound, unscripted, real. "That's what food can be," Keanu said. "A refuge, a way back to ourselves." He tucked the recipe back into his jacket and looked toward Marcus one last time. "You can spend a lifetime trying to shock people, or you can spend it trying to nourish them." Marcus didn't answer. His hands were still, his eyes had lost that mocking sheen. Keanu took a breath, then gave a small nod toward the audience. Not as a performer bowing out, but as a man acknowledging shared humanity. A few people began to clap. Softly at first, then a few more joined in. It wasn't the wild, roaring kind of applause, it was the reverent kind. The kind that comes from something deeper than excitement. From understanding. Miranda turned to the audience, her eyes red. "I think we all just witnessed something more than television," she said quietly. "We witnessed a lesson in humility." The crew, silent for nearly 15 minutes, finally began to stir. A boom mic slowly rose back into position. One of the cameramen wiped his eye and steadied the frame. Keanu remained still. Then, in the back row of the audience, an elderly woman with silver hair stood up and began to clap with both hands, slowly and deliberately. She didn't look at Marcus. She looked at Keanu. And that was the signal. More people rose, and soon the room was standing, not in ovation, but in tribute. Keanu didn't bask in it. He simply bowed his head. A small gesture of thanks. When the clapping faded, Miranda stepped forward. "Keanu, is there anything else you'd like to say?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he answered, "No, I think Carmen said enough through her food. I was just lucky enough to listen." And with that, he stepped back. Marcus remained seated, his face unreadable, but his hands were folded now, not clenched. His eyes were lowered. Something inside him was turning. Whether it would bloom or wither remained to be seen. But for the audience, for Miranda, for the crew, it was clear. The final statement had been made. And it didn't come from a script or a dish. It came from memory, from identity, from love made visible. The episode aired 2 nights later. By morning, the internet was on fire. Clips of Keanu's quiet monologue flooded timelines around the world. One short video, just 42 seconds long, titled "Keanu Defends Spanish Food with a Single Line," had been shared more than 1 million times within hours. On TikTok, people stitched their own reactions to his quote, "Food isn't just flavor, it's memory, it's identity, it's love made visible." Some cried while watching, others sat in stunned silence. The hashtag, Carmen Taught Me, began trending globally. Spanish chefs from Seville to San Diego shared emotional responses. In Madrid, A third-generation family-owned restaurant posted a photo of their grandmother stirring gazpacho with the caption, "She never asked for applause, just that you eat until your heart feels safe again." One post from a chef in Valencia read, "We have fought for years against being reduced to hashtags and tapas cliches. Today, Keanu Reeves gave us back our dignity in front of the world." On YouTube, reaction videos poured in. Culinary historians, restaurateurs, and everyday viewers dissected every moment of the show. One popular food critic from London uploaded a review titled, "Why Marcus Thornfield's Era May Be Over." It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about respect. For Marcus, the blowback was immediate. His agent posted a vague statement hours after the broadcast. Chef Thornfield has decided to take a brief sabbatical from public appearances to reflect and realign. The truth was harder to package. Several sponsors quietly distanced themselves. A major cookware brand pulled his promotional image from its homepage. His upcoming book tour across New York, Chicago, and Paris was abruptly postponed. Internally, his staff began leaking stories to the press. One former sous chef tweeted, "I once made a lentil stew inspired by my abuela." Marcus laughed and called it bean soup for prisoners. "I wish Keanu had been there that day." Another former assistant wrote, "He's always believed performance beats emotion. I hope now he learns to taste differently." Public opinion shifted fast. Comment sections turned from adoration to disillusionment. Turns out the real masterclass wasn't in technique, but in humility. Imagine being silenced by a man who never raised his voice. That's power. He believed Emma was keeping him from a new direction. Keanu didn't destroy Marcus. He revealed him. Despite it all, Keanu didn't respond. He didn't issue a tweet. He didn't hold a press conference. When asked for comment, his publicist replied, "Mr. Reeves prefers the episode to speak for itself." That silence only amplified the impact. The Global Kitchen Masters team, once skeptical of booking Keanu, now found themselves at the center of a media storm. Miranda Wells appeared on morning shows, recounting the moment. "I could feel it in the room," she told one host. "It wasn't a takedown, it was something far more human." Meanwhile, Marcus was nowhere to be seen. Paparazzi circled his residence in Soho but caught no glimpse. Some thought he'd fled the country. Others speculated on an impending apology tour. But then, something strange happened. A tourist in Andalusia posted a blurry photo of a man at a small countryside market near Cordoba. The caption read, "Pretty sure I just saw Marcus Thornfield buying tomatoes from a woman who looked like someone's grandma." No camera crew, no entourage, just him and a notepad. The photo went viral within hours. No one could say for sure if it was really Marcus, but the story surrounding it took on a life of its own. People didn't just want proof. They wanted a narrative of change, of humility, of listening. And this image, a man once ridiculed for arrogance, standing silently at a market stall, scribbling in a notebook while an elderly vendor smiled beside him, fit that hope. A journalist from a Spanish food magazine followed up the next day. Her report was brief but striking. "Yes," the vendor confirmed. "He asked about the tomatoes, then about my husband, then about my mother's soup. He didn't speak much, just listened." Rumors continued to swirl. Marcus was spotted days later in Granada, sitting at a rustic tapas bar known only to locals. A handwritten sign had been posted above the counter, "We serve memory, not menus." Whether Marcus had come to rebuild or simply to understand was unclear, but for the first time in his career, he wasn't shouting. In a quiet shift, Keanu's impact had reached beyond the screen. Spanish eateries from Los Angeles to Tokyo saw a spike in bookings. People lined up not just for food, but for the experience behind it. Small, family-run places with no Instagram presence suddenly had wait lists. Patrons asked servers where their recipes came from, who taught them, what stories lived in the spice and oil. One restaurant in Santa Fe offered a new dish called Carmen's gazpacho, served with a small handwritten card that read, "For when the world is too loud." Somewhere in Barcelona, the Mendoza family prepared paella in their backyard, unaware that a clip of Keanu describing their generosity had sparked a wave of donations to struggling family restaurants across Spain. A local reporter who played the segment for them said the grandmother clutched her chest and whispered, "We fed him because he looked like someone who needed to be reminded he mattered." And that's exactly what resonated. It wasn't just Keanu's words or Marcus's silence. It was the shift. The invitation to see food not as trend but as truth. Chefs from other countries began weighing in. A Filipino cook in San Diego posted, "We've been laughed at for using fish sauce in stews. Now I feel seen." An Indian food blogger wrote, "Keanu's story reminded me of my grandmother making chapati by lantern light during power cuts. That's sophistication." In a world obsessed with presentation, Keanu had reminded people of presence. By the end of the week, Marcus's team released one short, unpolished video on his official channel. No graphics, no intro, just Marcus in a plain white shirt, seated on a wooden bench with olive trees in the background. I used to think knowing more meant being better, but I realize now I've never listened enough. I'm not here to rebuild a brand. I'm here to relearn taste, and I'm starting with silence. That video reached over 12 million views in 3 days. Keanu never replied to it. He didn't need to. The world had already decided whose flavor lingered longer. And this time, it tasted like truth. The sun filtered softly through the lace curtain of a modest kitchen in Seville. A breeze moved in from the open window, carrying with it the warm scent of tomatoes, peppers, and fresh basil. Carmen Vasquez stood at the worn wooden counter, her apron slightly dusted with flour, sleeves rolled up, and her hands moving rhythmically, steadily, gracefully, as if time had never passed. She didn't own a television. The buzz from the outside world, broadcasts, commentaries, trending hashtags, none of it made its way into her home. And yet, she was at the center of it all without knowing. Her kitchen had become the unseen heartbeat of a cultural shift, but to Carmen, this morning was like any other. She hummed softly to herself as she sliced cucumbers, then placed them carefully into the large clay bowl she'd used for decades. She reached for the garlic next, the bulbs braided and hanging from a ceiling hook beside dried rosemary and thyme. The bowl sat firm in place, like an old friend that had never left her side. Carmen didn't cook to impress. She never had. To her, food wasn't performance. It was preservation. Memory. A kind of music passed down through touch and taste rather than notes and instruments. As she added olive oil, her hands slowed slightly. She looked toward the doorway, where a little girl used to run in from the garden, laughing and holding a tomato in both hands like a trophy. That girl, her granddaughter, Ana, was now grown and working in Madrid. But Carmen swore she could still hear her footsteps sometimes, racing in on summer afternoons. She stirred gently now, pausing only when the doorbell rang. The sound was light, not urgent. She wiped her hands, untied her apron, and made her way to the small entry table just inside the door. There, nestled among a few coupons and a utility bill, was a single white postcard. No return address, no printed logos, just her name, written in a hand she instantly recognized, even though she hadn't seen it in years. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped it over. The message was short, handwritten in blue ink. Gracias por todo. No signature, but none was needed. She smiled. A quiet smile. The kind built on 1,000 small shared moments, not grand gestures. The kind of smile that only comes from having loved and been loved in return, even if for a brief chapter of someone's life. She tucked the card gently into the corner of a framed photo on the kitchen shelf, one of her late husband standing beside her on their wedding day. Then she returned to her soup. The gazpacho was nearly done now. She tasted it from a wooden spoon, nodded to herself, and added a single pinch of salt. Outside, the neighborhood stirred to life. Cars passed, birds flitted between the wires overhead. But within Carmen's kitchen, time moved differently. Each motion was deliberate, each step sacred. She ladled the gazpacho into a simple ceramic bowl, the kind that had small chips along the rim from years of use. She didn't replace things that still worked. That was her way. And as she placed the bowl on the table, next to a crusty slice of bread rubbed with garlic and tomato, she looked out the window. A neighbor waved from across the courtyard. Carmen waved back. She sat down at the table, her back straight, her posture shaped by decades of caring for family, for food, for the quiet rituals that gave each day meaning. Her hands rested on the table for a moment before she picked up the spoon. She didn't rush. She never did. Each bite was deliberate, but not because she was savoring luxury. There was no extravagance in the meal. But there was abundance in memory, in care, in the hundreds of times she had prepared this same dish, not just for herself, but for others, children, grandchildren, neighbors, strangers, and once for a man who had walked into her life quietly and respectfully. A man who had lost something then, perhaps faith, perhaps direction. She never asked. She only offered a place to sit and something warm to fill his body, and maybe his heart. He never told her much, but he always listened. She remembered his eyes more than his words, how they stayed soft even when he was hurting, how he watched her move around the kitchen like it was a sacred space, how he never asked for anything, but always said thank you. And now, years later, a simple postcard had arrived. It carried no explanation, yet it held more weight than volumes. Gracias por todo. Carmen took another bite. The soup was perfect. Not because the vegetables were extraordinary, they were from her own garden, not because she had followed a strict recipe, she never measured, but because it was made the way it always had been, with memory, with reverence, with purpose. A small breeze stirred the postcard on the shelf. It fluttered, then settled again. She smiled. The world was changing. She could feel it in the small ways, like the young woman at the market yesterday, asking how she made her tomato puree so silky. Like the letter from Anna, saying more people were talking about real food on television, and how her classmates at university were asking where she learned to cook. Carmen didn't need fame. She didn't want cameras. She wanted warmth. She wanted flavor that stayed. And somehow, without knowing, she had passed that on. She stood and cleared her bowl, washed it by hand, humming the same soft melody she'd been humming earlier. She dried the bowl and placed it back on the shelf. Then, with a glance toward the window where the light was beginning to soften, she reached for her apron once more. She had more tomatoes to peel, more meals to prepare, not for headlines, but for life. And as the knife touched the skin of the next tomato, she whispered quietly, to no one and to everyone, always with love. Keanu walked slowly through the narrow lanes of a sun-dappled outdoor market just outside Valencia. The morning light filtered through rows of striped awnings, casting golden streaks across woven baskets, vibrant peppers, and tables brimming with bread still warm from the oven. The scent of roasted almonds drifted in the air, mingling with the faint salt carried from the nearby coast. He didn't speak. There was no camera crew, no production lights, no audience watching. Just Keanu, walking, observing, listening. To the clatter of market crates being opened. To the elderly couple bargaining gently over olives. To a child laughing as she bit into a fresh orange, handed to her by a smiling vendor. This was where food lived. Not in studios or ratings charts. Not in elevated voices or calculated performances. But here, in the hush between strangers sharing bread, in the casual grace of a mother handing her son a paper-wrapped empanada. Keanu paused by a stall run by a woman with silver hair and a floral scarf tied around her neck. Her hands moved with the same careful rhythm he'd seen once in Carmen Vasquez's kitchen. She didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on arranging tomatoes in rows, sorting by ripeness and color, humming under her breath as she worked. He bought one without a word, bit into it slowly, standing at the edge of the stall. The skin burst with sun-warmed juice, sweet, earthy, familiar. And just like that, he was back in Carmen's home for a fleeting second. The worn table, the soft clink of her spoon in the bowl, the feeling of not being alone. As he walked on, his thoughts settled into clarity. Some truths couldn't be argued or proven. They had to be lived. That was the lesson Marcus had never understood. You couldn't learn humility from a book. You couldn't master respect by memorizing facts. And no amount of plating precision could match the taste of a dish made by someone who loved you enough to feed you. Every culture had its Carmen, someone who held the thread of tradition, memory, and meaning together. Quietly, uncelebrated, but essential. And when you were lucky enough to meet that person, your job wasn't to question or critique. It was to listen, to sit down, to eat what was offered, and let it change you. Keanu watched as two teenage boys passed by on bicycles, one handing the other a piece of grilled bread wrapped in foil. They weren't talking about technique. They weren't filming for an audience. They were just hungry and sharing what they had. He smiled. There was more wisdom in that moment than in 100 televised masterclasses. The market shifted around him, a living rhythm of motion and stillness. A grandmother told a joke in Catalan to a fishmonger who laughed so hard he wiped his eyes with his apron. A young woman dipped a spoon into a communal bowl of stew, nodded in satisfaction, and bought 2 servings for her parents, waiting in the plaza nearby. This was Spain, not just the nation, but the spirit. And it hadn't come to life through argument or ego. It had emerged again and again through kindness, sharing, and the deeply human act of nourishment. Keanu sat on a low stone wall at the edge of the market, a small paper bag of roasted chestnuts warming his hands. He looked out at the crowd, not to be seen, but to see. A young man lifted a crate of produce onto his shoulder. A toddler giggled in her mother's arms as she was fed tiny spoonfuls of flan. No moment was rushed, no gesture was wasted. Everything belonged exactly where it was. In a quiet voice, almost like a whisper against the breeze, his thoughts took shape. True understanding isn't taught from a stage. It's absorbed slowly through living, through helping someone clean a counter after a long day, through staying at the table after the meal is over, just to listen, through tasting something that was made not to impress you, but to take care of you. It's in the silence between words, in the way someone hands you a fork without asking why you're hungry, in the way a stranger pours you a glass of water and makes room at their table without knowing your name. Sophistication, real sophistication, lives in simplicity. Not in the number of ingredients, but in the generosity behind them. Keanu glanced down into the paper bag and picked up a single chestnut. He broke the shell, revealing the warm, soft core. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't a show, but it filled him with a gratitude deeper than language. That was Carmen's gift. She had never asked for recognition. She had never filmed a single dish. He had never read a restaurant review. But she had fed him when he didn't know what he needed. And in doing so, she had given him something no amount of prestige or applause could ever equal. She had given him peace. As the breeze stirred and the market moved around him, Keanu stood. He walked slowly past the bread vendor, the olive man, the stand where someone had just sliced a wedge of manchego for a little girl too shy to ask for it. He nodded gently, no longer a visitor or a tourist, but a man who had been changed by what he now understood. As the path narrowed and the edge of the market approached, a quiet smile returned to his face. He didn't need to speak anymore. The world had already heard what needed to be said. But before the video ends, there's something he wants to leave you with. A question. Have you ever had a meal that changed how you see the world? Not because it was perfect, but because it was made by someone who cared? Think about it. Maybe it wasn't about the food at all. Maybe it was about the person who served it. And if you've been lucky enough to taste that kind of love, tell us. Because those stories deserve to be remembered. And if you'd like to see Keanu explore more cultures, more hidden kitchens, and more stories like Carmen's, tell us in the comments, what culture should he explore next? We read every response, and the next journey may begin with your suggestion. Thank you for watching this incredible story. We'll see you in the next one.